Chapter 4 The Safe Food Handler. As a manager, owner, restaurateur, it's going to be very important that you are managing your food handlers, watching their food handling practices, watching their hygiene, and of course, correcting and training them when needed. Food safety is in your hands. So, managers must focus on establishing specific personal hygiene policies. Managers must focus on training food handlers with regard to personal hygiene and retraining them regularly. Managers must model correct behavior at all times. Manager required to supervise food safety practices. And if the food code changes or the laws change or science changes, then you should revise your policies and train your staff immediately. So, how can food handlers contaminate food? Well, with some illnesses, a person may infect others before showing symptoms. For example, a person could spread hepatitis A for weeks before having any symptoms. Or other illnesses such as norovirus, a person can infect others for days or even months after symptoms are gone. Some people also carry pathogens and infect others without getting sick themselves. Remember Salmonella typhi? There are other people that are common carriers of Staphylococcus aureus in their nose. About 30 to 50% of healthy adults carry Staphylococcus aureus. Food handlers can transfer this bacteria to food by touching their body parts and then not washing their hands. So obviously, food handlers can contaminate food if they have a foodborne illness or if they have symptoms like diarrhea or vomiting. A symptom like jaundice would indicate they potentially have hepatitis A. A wound could have Staphylococcus aureus. By sneezing and coughing consistently, it could disperse pathogens in the food preparation area. And if you come in contact with a sick person, that could be an issue. And be mindful that these bacteria and viruses are ubiquitous. If we touch anything that may contaminate our hands and don't wash them, we could spread these organisms. Did you know the average food handler does 9 activities an hour that could contaminate food? They do things like scratch their scalp or run their fingers through their hair. They wipe or touch their nose. They rub their ear. They touch a pimple or an infected wound. They touch their dirty uniform or cough and sneeze on their hand. They spit in an operation, just to name a few of the activities. So make sure you're watching and supervising your food handlers. So be sure to create policies that incorporate personal hygiene activities that you would like your workers to follow, like maintaining personal cleanliness, like wearing a clean and appropriate clothing or uniform, like restraining their hair and removing jewelry, like avoiding unsanitary habits and actions, maintaining good health, covering wounds, and of course reporting any symptoms or illness. But it's up to you to train your staff and enforce these policies. This whole slide is testable on these certification exams, so make sure you memorize all these things. The total hand washing process is at least 20 seconds. We should be using water at about 100 degrees or as hot as you can stand. Second, you should apply soap enough to build up a good lather. Third, make sure you are scrubbing your hands vigorously under your fingernails and up your arms for about 10 to 15 seconds. Rinse your hands thoroughly with clean running water. And then the best way is to dry your hands with a single-use paper towel. Use that towel to turn off the faucet and open the restroom door. So when do we wash our hands? Well, definitely before we start work and after using the restroom, or After handling raw meat, poultry, or seafood, and of course before handling that. After touching our face, our hair, our body. After sneezing, coughing, or using a tissue or handkerchief. After eating, drinking, smoking, or chewing gum or tobacco, this could easily transfer saliva. After handling chemicals that may come in contact with food. Of course, wash your hand after taking out the trash and clearing tables or bussing dirty dishes. Of course, after touching your clothing or aprons or handling money. If you leave the food preparation area or kitchen, you should wash your hands immediately after returning. After handling service animals or aquatic animals. And I like this one the best, after touching anything else that may contaminate your hands. Remember, these pathogens or organisms that we're up against are everywhere. They're ubiquitous, so practice washing your hands frequently and consistently. So the use of hand antiseptics or sanitizers are acceptable in the food industry, as long as they're used after hand washing and comply with all federal regulations by the FDA and the EPA. They must never be used in place of hand washing, and because it's a chemical, should be allowed to dry before touching food and equipment. So hand care is important in our business. It's the most important tool in the kitchen. I want to tell you to minimize hand contact when you can, but of course we need our hands and we will come in contact with food eventually. So make sure our fingernails are short and clean. Do not wear false nails and do not wear nail polish. The only time it would be acceptable to have fingernails or nail polish is when you are wearing intact gloves. So let's make sure we're managing our hands and the wounds or cuts. If they contain pus or infected, it may need to be excluded from the operation. If it's just a minor cut, it can be covered with a bandage and an impermeable cover like a finger cot or a single-use glove. Make sure that any wounds are covered and make sure that the dry and tight-fitting bandages do not allow any contamination. So most jurisdictions will allow bare hand contact. So be mindful of your jurisdiction and what are the rules. But I would say minimize bare hand contact with any ingredient or food that it's not going to be cooked to at least 145 degrees. So let's minimize that and never handle ready-to-eat food with your bare hands if you are serving high-risk people. Remember, high-risk people are people that are older, younger, and immunocompromised. So food can easily be contaminated when handled by bare hands. This is especially true when hands have not been washed correctly or have infected cuts or wounds. For this reason alone, let's minimize bare hand contact. So single-use gloves are not that bad, but this is one of the things that I see improperly used a lot out there in industry. So let's make sure that we're using them when handling ready-to-eat food. It would not be needed when washing produce. It would not be needed when handling a food that's going to be further cooked or cooked. Never think that gloves are acceptable in replacement of hand washing. And never think your hands don't need to be washed prior to putting on gloves. They must be washed. The gloves must fit correctly. When they're torn or ripped, they must be replaced. A few more things on gloves. Make sure, again, you wash and dry your hands before putting them on. Make sure you choose the correct size. Make sure you hold the gloves by the edge when putting them on. Don't blow in the gloves. Do not roll them up. That's likely going to contaminate the gloves and in turn contaminate food. Gloves are good, but gloves ain't God. So as soon as they're dirty or torn, replace them. Between tasks, you should be washing your hands, changing your gloves. If you take a call using your gloves, they should be changed. After handling raw meat, seafood, or poultry, you should wash your hands and change gloves. Gloves can give food handlers a false sense of security, especially if they are not chained as often as they should. Reinforce correct glove use with all food handlers. I would like you to develop a strict policy on work attire, enforcing it daily, making sure that people have clean hat or hair restraint, wear clean clothing, remove aprons when leaving food preparation areas. Jewelry on hands and arms is strictly enforced by regulatory folks, so there should be no bracelets or watches, and the only thing that's allowed on hands and arms is a plain band ring. So hair restraints will keep hair away from food and keep food handlers from touching it. Do not wear hair accessories that could become a physical contaminant. Hair restraints should be limited to items that keep hands out of hair and hair out of food. Food handlers with facial hair should wear a beard restraint. The transmission of saliva is a concern in the industry. Workers eating, drinking, smoking, or chewing gum or tobacco in food preparation areas could easily transfer saliva, and in the saliva could be pathogenic organisms. So food handlers must not eat, drink, or smoke, or chew gum when prepping or serving food, or when in work or prep areas, or when working in areas that are cleaning utensils or storing utensils. Small droplets of saliva can contain thousands of pathogens, and in the process of eating, drinking, or smoking, saliva can be transferred to hands, and then the hands could then transfer that saliva to foods. There is a couple exceptions with drinks. If they are covered and have a straw, those would be acceptable in food preparation areas as long as they're stored below food prep areas. As a food protection manager, you have to train your staff. You must encourage your staff to report any health problems before they come to work. This includes your newly hired staff who haven't started working yet. Staff should also know immediately if they are sick while working. Your regulatory authority may ask you to prove you have made staff aware of this policy. Reporting health issues. If the food handler has a sore throat with a fever, then restrict the food handler from working with or around food. Exclude the food handler from the operation if you're primarily serving a high-risk population, such as the elderly, preschool-aged children and younger, or immunocompromised, and require a written release from a medical practitioner before coming back to work. If a food handler has vomiting or diarrhea as a symptom, then the manager should exclude the food handler from the operation. Before returning to work, the food handler who vomited or had diarrhea must meet one of these requirements. They've had no symptoms for at least 24 hours, or they have a written release from a medical practitioner. If a food handler has jaundice, a yellowing of the eyes and skin, then exclude the food handler from the operation if they have had jaundice for 7 days or less. Report the food handler to the regulatory authority, and the food handler must have a written release from a medical practitioner and approval from the regulatory authority before returning to work. If the food handler is vomiting or has diarrhea and has been diagnosed with an illness caused by one of these pathogens, Salmonella, E. coli, norovirus, Shigella, then exclude the food handler from the operation, work with the food handler's medical practitioner and or local regulator to decide when the person can go back to work. Some food handlers diagnosed with these foodborne illnesses may not experience usual signs, or their symptoms may be over. Be sure to work with a local regulator to determine whether the food handler must be excluded from the operation or restricted from working around food. Whether or not a food handler has symptoms, those diagnosed with disease caused by pathogens must be excluded from the operation. Work with your local regulatory authority to determine when exclusion can be removed. Remember, these are only guidelines. Working with your regulatory authority will help to determine the best course of action. For food handlers that have been diagnosed with an illness caused by hepatitis A or Salmonella typhi, exclude the food handler from the operation. Work with the food handler's medical practitioner and or local regulatory authority to decide when the person can go back to work.